Have you noticed how it always feels like something is missing? As if there's an invisible piece missing from the puzzle of your life. What if I told you this is intentional? Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, almost polite way. Subtle enough that you doubt yourself instead of questioning the structure around you. Why does it seem that the more you search for freedom, the more trapped you feel? You work harder, learn more, improve yourself, yet the sense of relief never fully arrives. Maybe the right question was never, "What should I do?" but something far less comfortable. What haven't I noticed yet? From the moment you wake up, your attention is pulled outward. Problems to solve, standards to meet, noise to respond to. You're taught to stay busy, not aware, to move forward, not inward. And over time, that missing piece becomes normal. You assume it's just life. But what if that feeling is not a flaw in you? What if it's a signal that your attention has been guided away from the one place where clarity actually lives? Because a person who never notices where they're looking can be led almost anywhere, without ever feeling forced. From the moment you entered this world, your attention was gently but firmly pointed in one direction. Before you had language, before you had choice, you were already being shown where to look, toward approval, toward results, toward what others expect. Little by little, your gaze was trained to move outward, away from the quiet center where your own understanding lives. Think about your earliest lessons. They were not about how to listen to yourself. They were about how to behave, how to fit in, how to perform well enough to be rewarded. You learned very early that value comes from outside: good grades, praise, success, recognition. No one sat with you and said, "Pay attention to what you feel before you act." No one asked you to notice the space between a thought and a decision. That kind of attention was never part of the curriculum. As you grew, the message became more sophisticated, but the direction stayed the same. Look ahead, look up, look at the next goal, look at what you're missing, look at who you should become. Life became a series of checkpoints, and you were told that meaning would arrive later. After the next achievement, after the next milestone, after you finally prove something. Meanwhile, the present moment became something to rush through, not something to inhabit. This conditioning is subtle, which is why it works so well. It doesn't feel like control, it feels like normal life. You wake up, you check the world outside of you, you respond to demands, you solve problems, you chase improvements. At no point are you encouraged to pause and ask, "From where is this impulse coming?" Or, "Who is the one experiencing all of this?" Those questions are quietly removed from the conversation. Over time, you begin to confuse motion with progress, activity with meaning, noise with aliveness. And because everyone around you is doing the same thing, it feels validated. The collective agreement becomes stronger than your private doubts. If a sense of emptiness appears, you're told it's because you haven't done enough yet, haven't achieved enough yet, haven't optimized yourself enough yet. So you keep looking outward for the answer to an inward question. Even spirituality, when it enters the picture, often follows the same pattern. It becomes another thing to acquire, another identity to wear, another system to follow correctly. Instead of pointing you back to direct experience, it often gives you more concepts, more rules, more authorities to consult. The direction remains unchanged, away from yourself, towards something or someone else who supposedly knows better. What's rarely acknowledged is how disorienting this is for the nervous system. When your attention is always pulled outward, you lose sensitivity to your own signals. You stop trusting your internal timing. You override fatigue, ignore intuition, suppress discomfort. You become skilled at functioning but less skilled at sensing. And a person who cannot sense clearly is easy to guide, easy to persuade, easy to keep busy. At some point, many people notice a strange contradiction. They've done what they were told. They've followed the script reasonably well. And yet there's a persistent feeling that something is off. Not dramatically wrong, just subtly misaligned, like wearing shoes that almost fit. That discomfort is often the first hint that the direction you were taught to look may not be the direction where truth is found. Looking inward doesn't mean withdrawing from life or rejecting the world. It means restoring balance. It means remembering that every belief, every fear, every desire is experienced inside you before it ever becomes action. When that inner space is ignored, your life is shaped by forces you never examine. When it's acknowledged even briefly, something begins to shift. You start to notice how automatic many of your responses are, how quickly you defend ideas you never consciously chose. This is why the habit of constant distraction is so powerful. If there's always something to watch, something to fix, something to worry about, there's no room to notice how you're being guided. No space to feel the tension of living according to rules you didn't write. Silence would make that tension visible, and visibility is the first step toward change. The conditioning to look in the wrong direction isn't about making you weak. It's about making you forgetful. Forgetful of your own capacity to observe. Forgetful of the fact that before any system, any role, any identity, there is a simple awareness noticing what is happening. That awareness doesn't need permission. It doesn't need validation. But once you reconnect with it, it becomes harder to accept invisible limits as absolute truths. And that's where things start to get uncomfortable, because when you slowly turn your attention back toward yourself, you begin to see that what has been guiding you all along was never a solid structure made of walls or chains. It was something far less visible and far more intimate. When most people hear the word prison, they imagine something obvious. Cold metal, locked doors, guards, force. Something you can clearly point to and say, that's what's keeping me trapped. But the structure you're living inside doesn't look like that at all. That's why it works. There are no bars to grab, no walls to push against. And yet, you move through your days, following the same narrow paths, repeating the same reactions, defending the same limits, often without realizing why. This prison was built quietly over time, from ideas rather than iron. It's made of beliefs you absorbed before you ever had the chance to question them. Beliefs about who you are allowed to be, what is realistic for you, what is too much to ask for, what is just the way life is. None of these were proven to you. They were repeated, modeled, rewarded, and slowly accepted as facts. The most effective part of this structure is that it feels personal. You don't experience it as an external force. You experience it as your own thinking. A voice that says, I can't do that, or people like me don't live that way, or this is just how things are. Because the voice sounds like you trust it, you defend it, you build your life around it, and in doing so, you reinforce the very limits that restrict you. What makes this even more subtle is that the prison adapts. It changes shape as you grow. When you're young, it tells you to obey. When you're older, it tells you to be realistic. When you're tired, it tells you not to risk. When you're curious, it distracts you. The rules aren't written down anywhere, but you feel them every time you hesitate, every time you shrink an impulse before it fully forms. You may have noticed how quickly discomfort is avoided, how fast the mind moves to justify, explain, or distract when something feels unsettling. That reflex isn't accidental. If you were to stay with that discomfort just a little longer, you might see that it's not danger you're sensing, but constraint, a tightness that comes from living inside assumptions you've never examined. The prison relies on speed, on keeping you moving, reacting, adjusting, but never really stopping to look. And perhaps the most surprising part is this. You actively help maintain it, not because you want to be trapped, but because familiarity feels safer than uncertainty. Even when the familiar is limiting, it's predictable, so you defend your routines, your roles, your explanations. You tell yourself stories about why things can't change, why now isn't the right time, why this is as good as it gets. These stories feel protective, but they also keep the walls intact. There's a certain identity that forms inside this structure, an identity built around coping rather than choosing, around managing life rather than questioning its underlying rules. Over time, you may even take pride in how well you endure, how much you can handle, how adaptable you are. And while resilience has value, it can also become a trap when it replaces honesty. When survival becomes more important than truth, the prison doesn't punish you for trying to see it. It simply overwhelms you with responsibilities, with noise, with urgency, with endless small demands that consume your attention. By the end of the day, you're too tired to question anything deeper. And so the cycle continues, not because it's enforced, but because it's uninterrupted. Yet cracks begin to appear when you notice one simple thing. These limits are not physical. They exist only as long as they are believed. The moment you see a belief as a belief, not a fact, something loosens. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to create space, enough to breathe differently, enough to wonder, even briefly, what might exist beyond the edges of the story you've been living inside. This is not about rebelling against everything or rejecting the world you're part of. It's about recognizing that many of the rules guiding your life were inherited, not chosen. And what is inherited can be examined. When you start to observe your own thoughts, instead of immediately obeying them, you begin to notice how repetitive they are, how predictable, how rarely they reflect the full reality of who you are. And as this awareness grows, another realization starts to form quietly in the background. If the prison is not made of iron, if it is built from beliefs and agreements, then it can be entered and exited in ways that have nothing to do with force. But that realization brings a different kind of discomfort, because it raises an unsettling question about who benefits from keeping those beliefs unquestioned in the first place. At some point, many people sense that the usual answers are not enough. Success doesn't satisfy the way it was promised. Productivity feels empty. So the search turns inward, or at least it seems to. This is often when spirituality enters the picture, and yet even here, the same invisible patterns quietly take over. What began as a personal, direct relationship with existence slowly became something managed, packaged, and sold. Instead of guiding you back to your own experience, spirituality was reshaped into a system of beliefs, techniques, hierarchies, and identities. Something you join, something you follow, something you do the right way. The direction subtly shifts again away from your own perception and toward external authority. You can see this in how quickly spiritual language turns into labels: awakened, evolved, conscious, enlightened. These words start to define who is ahead and who is behind. Comparison sneaks back in, wearing a softer mask, and once comparison is there, so is insecurity. Am I doing this correctly? Am I spiritual enough? Am I missing something everyone else seems to have found? The search that was meant to free you quietly becomes another race. Instead of silence, you're given endless explanations. Instead of presence, you're given practices to perfect. Instead of trust in your own awareness, you're offered teachers, methods, steps, and promises. None of these are inherently wrong. But when they replace your own observation, they become another layer between you and what you're seeking. The focus moves from noticing what is happening now to chasing an imagined future state. The system is very good at absorbing threats and turning them into products. Spirituality was no exception. What once pointed beyond control became a controlled space. Retreats, courses, certifications, exclusive knowledge. The message may sound liberating, but the structure often mirrors everything you were trying to escape. Authority at the top, followers at the bottom, and an unspoken rule: don't trust your experience unless it matches the approved framework. One of the clearest signs of this takeover is urgency, the sense that you must fix yourself, heal faster, raise your vibration, clear your blocks. There's always something wrong that needs attention, and conveniently there's always something to buy or adopt to address it. The underlying message is familiar: you are not enough yet. And just like before, fulfillment is placed somewhere in the future. What gets lost in all of this is something very simple: your direct, unfiltered experience, the quiet noticing of breath, sensation, thought, and emotion as they arise. No interpretation, no improvement plan, just awareness. This doesn't generate profit. It doesn't create dependency. It doesn't make you easier to categorize or lead, and because of that, it's rarely emphasized for long. Instead, spirituality becomes performance. The right words, the right beliefs, the right aesthetic. You learn how to talk about presence without actually being present. You learn how to explain awareness without resting in it. And because the explanations are convincing, it can take years to notice that something essential is missing. The same subtle emptiness that existed before, now dressed in more meaningful language. There is also fear woven into this version of spirituality. Fear of doing it wrong, fear of negative energy, fear of falling back asleep. These fears keep you vigilant, self-monitoring, constantly evaluating your inner state. But true awareness is not anxious. It doesn't require constant correction. It simply sees. The moment spirituality feels tense, heavy, or pressurized, something has already been distorted. The deeper truth is uncomfortable for any system built on control. No one stands between you and what you are. There is no gatekeeper for awareness, no membership required for presence. The connection people are searching for is not hidden behind complexity. It is available in the most ordinary moments when attention stops trying to get somewhere else. But that kind of simplicity is threatening, because a person who can sit quietly and observe without immediately reacting is harder to manipulate, harder to rush, harder to convince that they are broken or lacking. So the focus is subtly pulled back toward doing, achieving, identifying. Even in spiritual spaces, the old habits remain. As this becomes visible, a quiet shift begins, not toward rejecting spirituality, but toward reclaiming it, away from systems that tell you who to be, and back toward your own capacity to notice what is happening without interference. And once you start to sense how often your reactions are shaped for you, a new question begins to form beneath the surface. What would happen if, instead of reacting so quickly, you simply observed? Somewhere along the way, observation stopped being valued, and speed took its place. You were taught that a fast response means intelligence, that having an opinion ready means strength, that reacting immediately means you're engaged and alive. Silence, hesitation, or pause began to look like weakness. And slowly, almost without noticing, the natural human capacity to observe was exchanged for the constant impulse to react. Reaction feels productive. It creates the sense that something is happening, that you are participating, that you are in control. But most reactions are not choices. They are habits. Conditioned responses triggered by familiar patterns, a tone of voice, a headline, a memory, a fear. Before awareness has a chance to enter, the body tightens, the mind rushes forward, and a decision is already being made. This is why life can start to feel repetitive even when the circumstances change. The situations look different, but your responses remain the same. The same defenses, the same justifications, the same emotional loops. Observation would reveal this repetition, but reaction keeps you moving too fast to notice it. And as long as you don't notice, nothing truly changes. The environment you live in reinforces this constantly. Notifications demand immediate attention. News cycles thrive on urgency. Conversations reward quick answers over thoughtful presence. You're trained to respond before you've fully felt what's happening, to speak before you've listened, to act before you've seen. Over time, this creates a subtle anxiety, a background tension that never fully settles. Observation, on the other hand, has no urgency. It doesn't rush to fix or explain. It stays with what is actually happening, even when that feels uncomfortable. This is precisely why it's rarely encouraged. A person who observes begins to notice the gap between stimulus and response. And in that gap, something powerful appears. Choice. When you observe, you start to see how often your reactions are borrowed. You react the way you were taught to react. You defend ideas you inherited. You feel offended in predictable places. You chase approval in familiar ways. None of this is personal, but it feels personal because it happens inside you. Observation gently exposes this, not with judgment, but with clarity. This is also where many people feel resistance. Observation can feel passive at first, even threatening. If you don't react, who are you? If you don't immediately defend yourself, will you disappear? These fears are understandable. Reaction has been tied to identity for a long time. To stop reacting can feel like losing ground, even though what you're actually losing is compulsion. The body plays a key role here. Reaction is often physical before it's mental. A tightening in the chest, a shallow breath, a surge of energy looking for release. Observation begins by feeling these sensations without immediately acting on them. Just noticing, not suppressing, not indulging. This alone can change the entire trajectory of a moment. The system you live inside depends on reaction. Outrage fuels attention. Fear drives compliance. Comparison keeps you striving. None of this works if you pause long enough to see what's happening. Observation interrupts the automatic flow. It creates friction where there used to be speed. And friction slows things down enough for awareness to enter. When awareness enters, something subtle shifts. You may still feel anger, desire, or fear, but they no longer fully possess you. They become experiences rather than commands. This doesn't make you passive, it makes you precise. You act when action is needed and you don't when it isn't. That distinction alone changes everything. This is why reclaiming observation is not just a personal practice, but a quiet form of independence. You are no longer as easily pulled by every signal, every demand, every emotional hook. You begin to sense when something is trying to use your reaction for its own momentum, and once you see that, reacting automatically becomes less appealing. At first, this shift is almost invisible. It shows up as a pause before speaking, a breath before responding, a moment of noticing before deciding. But those small pauses accumulate. They create a different rhythm of living, one where you are less predictable, less programmable, less reactive. And as this rhythm takes hold, another realization starts to emerge. If so much control depends on your reactions, then the moment you stop feeding them automatically, something else begins to weaken. The structures that rely on your urgency, your fear, your constant engagement start to lose their grip. Which raises a question that lingers just beneath the surface. What would happen if you stayed in observation long enough to find the one place where none of that noise can reach you? Awakening is often talked about as something dramatic, like a sudden explosion of insight that separates you from the rest of the world. But in reality, it's much quieter than that. It begins the moment you stop needing the system to tell you who you are, what to want, or how to feel about your own life. And that quiet shift is exactly what makes it threatening. The system you live inside doesn't survive on force alone. It survives on relevance, on being necessary, on positioning itself as the bridge between you and safety, meaning, success, or belonging. As long as you believe you need it to function, to be okay, to be whole, it maintains its power. Awakening weakens that belief at the root. When you start to see clearly, you become less dependent. You don't need constant validation to trust your own perception. You don't need endless explanations to feel grounded. You don't need promises about the future to tolerate the present. This doesn't make you disengaged from life. It makes you less exploitable within it. Notice how many structures are built around the idea that you are incomplete, that something is missing, that without guidance, authority, or constant improvement, you will fall behind. This sense of lack keeps you searching, buying, following, adjusting. Awakening interrupts that search, not by giving you everything, but by showing you that the ground you're standing on was never as unstable as you were told. This is why awakening is often discouraged in subtle ways. It's labeled as impractical, unrealistic, or even dangerous. You're warned that if you stop striving, you'll become passive. If you stop chasing, you'll lose motivation. If you stop believing the story, you'll fall apart. These warnings are effective because they speak to fear, not truth. A person who is awakening doesn't withdraw from responsibility. They simply stop being driven by unconscious pressure. They still work, still relate, still participate, but the internal relationship changes. Life is no longer something to constantly manage or fix. It becomes something to engage with from a place of choice rather than compulsion. From that place, many of the system's offers lose their appeal. The endless upgrades, the manufactured urgency, the promise that fulfillment is just one more step away. You begin to sense when something is designed to keep you dependent rather than genuinely supported. And once you sense that, it's difficult to unsee. This doesn't mean the system collapses overnight. It means your participation changes. You become selective. You don't give your attention so easily. You don't internalize every demand as a personal failure. You start to notice when fear is being used as leverage, and without your automatic agreement, that leverage weakens. What truly unsettles the system is not rebellion, but clarity. Rebellion still reacts. It still needs an enemy. Clarity simply sees. And seeing removes the emotional fuel that keeps many structures running. When you're no longer trying to escape or attack, but simply understand, control becomes much harder to maintain. There's also a deep simplicity in awakening that threatens complexity-based authority. You realize you don't need to be constantly stimulated to feel alive. You don't need constant noise to avoid yourself. You can sit with uncertainty without immediately filling it with answers. That capacity alone changes how you move through the world. And yet, this clarity can feel lonely at first. Not because you're separate from others, but because so much of social life is built around shared illusions. Shared anxieties, shared scripts. When you stop fully believing in them, you may feel slightly out of step, not superior, just less compelled. This is where many people turn back, not because they were wrong, but because the familiar pull is strong. The system is always ready to welcome you back with distractions, identities, and goals. It doesn't punish you for waking up. It simply offers you endless ways to fall asleep again. But once you've tasted even a small amount of independence from that pull, something in you knows the difference. You know what it feels like to respond instead of react, to choose instead of comply, to rest in yourself without needing constant reassurance, and that knowing can't be taken away. As this awareness deepens, another layer starts to reveal itself. You begin to see that the system's influence depends not just on what you believe, but on how it frames reality itself, on the subtle stories of lack and insufficiency that shape what you think is possible. And once those stories come into view, the entire landscape begins to look different. One of the most powerful ways your perception has been shaped is through scarcity. Not just the obvious kind like money or time, but a deeper sense that there is never quite enough. Enough safety, enough opportunity, enough worth. This lens quietly edits how you see the world, what you expect from it, and how you move within it. From early on, you're taught that resources are limited and competition is natural, that if someone else has more, you must have less. This idea becomes so normal that it rarely feels like a belief. It feels like reality itself. And once scarcity is accepted as a fact, fear becomes reasonable. Comparison becomes logical. Hoarding, rushing, and self-protection begin to make sense. Through this lens, life looks like a race. There are winners and losers, and you must stay alert or fall behind. Time is never enough, so you rush. Love is never guaranteed, so you cling. Opportunities are rare, so you compromise yourself to secure them. None of this feels forced, it feels responsible, sensible, necessary. Scarcity also changes how you see yourself. Your value becomes conditional, something to earn, prove, or maintain. You measure your worth through productivity, usefulness, or how well you fit into the expectations around you. When approval feels scarce, you work harder to secure it. When security feels fragile, you accept conditions that quietly drain you. Even joy is affected. It becomes something that must be justified or delayed. You tell yourself you'll rest later, enjoy later, live later. For now, there's too much to handle, too much at stake. Scarcity always points you toward the future, where things might finally be okay, while quietly pulling you away from the present, where life is actually happening. What makes this lens so convincing is that it's constantly reinforced. News highlights what's missing or threatened. Advertising reminds you of what you lack. Social comparison keeps you aware of where you fall short. Over time, your attention is trained to scan for problems, gaps, and dangers. Abundance, when it appears, feels temporary or suspicious. This isn't to deny that limits exist in the physical world. Bodies get tired. Time passes. Resources need care. But scarcity goes far beyond practical limits. It becomes a world view, a constant background assumption that shapes decisions before you're even aware you're making them. And a person who sees the world through scarcity is easier to direct, easier to pressure, easier to keep in a state of low-level anxiety. Under this lens, cooperation often gives way to competition. Curiosity gives way to defensiveness. You protect what you have because you don't trust that more can come. You close instead of open. You hold back instead of explore. And slowly, the world feels smaller than it actually is. Perhaps the most subtle effect of scarcity is how it fragments your attention. When you believe there isn't enough, you're always calculating, measuring, comparing, planning. Very little energy remains for simple presence, for noticing what is already here, for appreciating what doesn't need to be earned or secured. This constant mental movement keeps you from settling into yourself. Scarcity also feeds guilt. If you rest, you feel lazy. If you say no, you feel selfish. If you enjoy something too freely, you feel undeserving. There's always an inner voice reminding you that you should be doing more, trying harder, preparing for what might go wrong. That voice doesn't sound cruel, it sounds responsible, but it keeps you tense. When you begin to question this lens, it can feel destabilizing. If scarcity isn't the whole truth, then many of your choices were made under false pressure. Many of your fears were inherited rather than necessary. This realization doesn't immediately replace scarcity with abundance. It simply creates a pause, a moment where you notice how often you act as if there's not enough, even when there is. In that pause, something else becomes visible. You start to see how often fear of loss drives behavior more than genuine desire. How often you say yes to avoid missing out, rather than because something is truly aligned, and you begin to sense that the lens itself is shaping what you see, not just reflecting reality. As this awareness grows, the grip of scarcity loosens slightly, not because everything changes, but because you start to notice how much of your inner tension is created by interpretation rather than fact. And once interpretation becomes visible, it becomes questionable. This questioning naturally draws you toward quieter spaces, moments without comparison, without pressure, places where the constant measuring stops, even briefly, because in those moments you can feel something that scarcity never allows for long: enoughness. And that feeling points toward a dimension of experience that remains untouched by the system's edits, a place where the noise fades and something more fundamental begins to speak. There is one place the system can't follow you, not because it's hidden or protected, but because it doesn't operate by the same rules. That place is inner silence, not the absence of sound, but the quiet space beneath the noise, the moment when thought slows, reactions soften, and nothing is being demanded from you. The system depends on movement, on stimulation, on constant input and output. As long as your attention is busy, pulled outward and fragmented, it can guide where that attention goes. But inner silence interrupts that flow. It offers nothing to grab onto, no fear to amplify, no desire to exploit, and because of that, it's rarely encouraged. Most people are uncomfortable with silence at first. When external noise fades, internal noise becomes louder. Thoughts rush in. Old emotions surface. Unfinished stories demand attention. This is often taken as a sign that silence isn't working, when in fact it's doing exactly what it does best, revealing what has been covered up by constant distraction. Inner silence doesn't require effort. You don't create it. You notice it. It appears naturally in small gaps, between breaths, between thoughts, in moments when you stop trying to fix or improve anything. These moments are brief at first, but they carry a different quality, a sense of space, of being grounded without needing to explain why. What makes inner silence so powerful is that it returns you to direct experience, before interpretation, before judgment, before fear turns into a story. In silence, you feel sensations as they are. You notice thoughts without immediately believing them. You sense the difference between a genuine need and a conditioned impulse. This clarity doesn't come from analysis. It comes from presence. The system has no language here, no leverage. It cannot tell you what to think when you are simply aware. It cannot rush you when time is no longer being measured. It cannot sell you a solution when nothing feels broken in that moment. Inner silence doesn't argue with the system. It makes it irrelevant. This is why so much of modern life is designed to avoid it. Background noise fills every space. Even moments that were once quiet are now occupied. Waiting rooms, commutes, evenings at home. Silence is treated as empty, something to be filled. But what if it's not empty at all? What if it's the only place where you can actually hear yourself? In inner silence, identity softens. You're not performing a role. You're not managing an image. You're not trying to become anything. You're simply here. And from that place, many of the pressures that once felt urgent lose their intensity. Not because they disappear, but because they no longer define you. This doesn't mean you stay silent forever or withdraw from life. It means you return from silence with a different orientation. You act from clarity rather than compulsion. You speak when something needs to be said, not to fill space or defend yourself, You make decisions without the constant background noise of fear and scarcity. Inner silence also reveals how much of your stress is generated internally, not by circumstances themselves, but by the stories layered on top of them. When those stories quiet down, even briefly, you may notice that your body relaxes, your breathing deepens, your perception widens. This is not a technique, it's a natural response to the absence of pressure. The more familiar you become with this space, the more you recognize when you've drifted away from it. You can feel the difference between living from reaction and living from awareness. And once you feel that difference, it becomes a reference point. Something real, something trustworthy. This is why inner silence is so disruptive. It doesn't need permission. It doesn't require belief. It doesn't belong to any ideology or authority. Anyone can notice it at any moment without explanation. And a person who knows how to return to silence cannot be fully captured by noise. As this quiet presence becomes more accessible, something else begins to shift. You start to see patterns more clearly. You notice how certain narratives repeat, how certain fears are recycled. And with that clarity comes a change in how you engage with the world. The game doesn't end, but you no longer play it the same way. And once that happens, the balance of control quietly begins to tilt. Awakening doesn't announce itself with fireworks. There's no clear moment where you cross a line and suddenly everything is different. Instead, the game changes quietly, almost imperceptibly. You begin to notice things you used to overlook. Patterns you once accepted without question start to stand out. And from the outside, your life may look the same, but from the inside, the rules no longer hold the same power. One of the first shifts is that urgency begins to fade, not because nothing matters, but because everything no longer feels like an emergency. You sense when pressure is artificial, when fear is being used to rush you into agreement or action. That awareness alone creates distance, and distance weakens control. You start to see how predictable many influences are. The same emotional triggers, the same narratives repeated in different forms, the same promises of safety or success tied to compliance. Once seen, these patterns lose their hypnotic quality. They may still appear, but they don't land the same way. You're no longer pulled automatically into their momentum. This is where control starts to slip. Systems rely on predictable responses, on people reacting the same way to the same stimuli. When your reactions change, the system has less data to work with, less leverage. You become harder to manage, not because you resist, but because you're no longer responding on cue. Another change is in how you relate to authority. You don't reject it outright, but you stop granting it automatic legitimacy. Titles, status, and confidence no longer impress you on their own. You listen, but you also check. You sense whether something aligns with your direct experience. This doesn't make you cynical. It makes you discerning. Fear also begins to lose its grip. Not all fear disappears, but the chronic background fear starts to dissolve. You realize how often fear was projected into the future to control your behavior in the present. When you're more anchored in now, those projections feel less convincing. You respond to real challenges as they arise, rather than living in constant anticipation of disaster. Perhaps the most destabilizing change from the system's perspective is that you stop outsourcing meaning. You no longer need constant reassurance that your life is on the right track. You don't measure your worth as obsessively. You don't look outward as much for confirmation that you're okay. This inner stability reduces dependence, and dependence is a cornerstone of control. Your attention also becomes more selective. You notice how many things are designed to capture and fragment it. You feel when something drains you versus when it nourishes you. And because attention is a form of energy, where you place it matters, the less attention you give to manufactured drama and false urgency, the weaker their influence becomes. What's interesting is that this shift doesn't require confrontation. You don't need to argue or convince anyone. In fact, arguing often feeds the same dynamics. Awakening changes the game because you stop playing certain roles. You don't take the bait as often. You don't amplify noise. You don't spread fear just because it's offered to you. From the outside, this can look like disengagement, but it's actually deeper engagement. You're present without being reactive, involved without being consumed. You can participate in the world without being owned by it. That balance is rare, and it's exactly what makes it powerful. As more of your actions come from clarity rather than compulsion, life feels less scripted. You may still face constraints, but you don't internalize them the same way. You don't confuse circumstances with identity. You don't mistake roles for reality. This inner separation is subtle, but it changes everything. And here's the part that often goes unnoticed. The system doesn't know how to respond to this kind of awakening. It can handle rebellion. It can handle conformity. But presence disrupts both. Presence doesn't feed extremes. It doesn't generate predictable outrage or blind obedience. It simply sees. As this way of being stabilizes, you start to recognize something even more fundamental. The system's control was never absolute. It was always conditional, dependent on your unconscious participation. And as that participation becomes more conscious, another layer of the illusion begins to thin. You start to see that what holds the entire structure together is not force, but belief. And once that belief wavers, the whole game starts to feel strangely fragile. There is something almost no one notices, even after they begin to question everything. It's easy to see the pressure, the manipulation, the control. It's harder to see what's actually holding it all together. Because the truth is unsettling in a very quiet way. The system does not sustain itself. It never did. It borrows its strength from you. This isn't about blame. It's about mechanics. A structure made of ideas, agreements, and habits has no power on its own. It needs attention to exist. It needs belief to feel solid. It needs participation to stay alive. And most of that participation happens unconsciously, through routine acceptance rather than active choice. Think about how many things you follow simply because that's how it's done. How many rules you obey without remembering when you agreed to them. How many fears guide your decisions without ever being questioned. None of this requires force. It only requires familiarity. And familiarity is incredibly persuasive. The system feels permanent because it is everywhere. In language, in norms, in expectations, in the way success and failure are defined. But permanence is an illusion created by repetition. The same ideas repeated long enough begin to feel like reality itself. You stop seeing them as constructs and start seeing them as facts. What's rarely seen is that belief doesn't have to be enthusiastic to be effective. It can be tired, passive, resigned. Even skeptical belief still feeds the structure, as long as behavior doesn't change. You can criticize the system all day long and still hold it up through unconscious obedience. This is why awareness is more disruptive than opposition. When belief begins to loosen, the system doesn't collapse dramatically. It wobbles. It loses coherence. You start to see contradictions that once felt normal, rules that no longer make sense, pressures that feel strangely hollow, and instead of reacting, you pause. That pause is everything. The system cannot survive without your internal agreement. Not your verbal agreement, but your emotional and psychological investment. The moment you stop taking certain narratives personally, they lose their charge. When you stop internalizing every demand as a reflection of your worth, the pressure weakens. This is also why so much energy is spent keeping you identified, with roles, with labels, with stories about who you are and where you belong. Identity creates attachment, and attachment creates compliance. If you believe you are your job, your status, your image, then threats to those things feel existential, and fear keeps you in line. But as identification softens, something unexpected happens. You realize you can step back without disappearing. You can question without collapsing. You can say no internally, even when you say yes externally. This inner freedom is subtle, but it changes the entire dynamic. The system appears vast, but its foundation is fragile. It relies on millions of small, unquestioned acts of compliance. Not dramatic obedience, but everyday acceptance. The moment enough of those acts become conscious, the structure starts to feel oddly thin. Not because it's attacked, but because it's no longer being unconsciously reinforced. This is why distraction is so important. A distracted person cannot see how much power they're giving away. They're too busy managing symptoms to notice the source, too focused on surviving the day to question the framework of their life. Awareness interrupts that cycle. not by offering answers, but by revealing how the cycle operates. And here is the quiet paradox. You don't need to withdraw from society to stop holding the illusion in place. You don't need to reject everything or live on the margins. The shift happens internally, in how seriously you take certain stories, in how much authority you grant to fear, in how quickly you obey without checking. As this becomes clearer, something almost surreal begins to happen. The system starts to feel less solid, less intimidating, not because it's gone, but because you can see through it. You see that it was never an external force standing over you. It was a shared agreement, sustained moment by moment, and when an agreement is seen clearly, it no longer has the same grip. You may still participate, but you do so consciously, selectively, without giving away your center. This is not rebellion, it's recognition. And recognition quietly changes everything. Nothing you've heard here was meant to give you something new. It was meant to remind you of something you already had. The key was never hidden in a system, a belief, or a future version of yourself. It was always in your ability to notice, to pause, to see clearly instead of reacting automatically. You don't need to destroy anything. You don't need to escape the world. You only need to stop obeying unconsciously. The moment you see what's been guiding you, it loses its grip. And from that clarity, your life doesn't become perfect. It becomes honest, more grounded, more yours. What happens next is not about big declarations. It's about small moments of awareness, repeated. Moments where you choose presence over pressure, observation over impulse, truth over habit. If this message reached you all the way to the end, write this sentence in the comments so I know you are here with me. I see more clearly now. And if this resonated with you, watch one of the videos appearing on your screen. They go deeper into this same space, for those who are ready to keep seeing.